Scene 4, Chapter 5 of No Name. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philip Griffiths. No Name by Wilkie Collins. Scene 4, Chapter 5. When Magdalen appeared in the parlour shortly before 7 o'clock, not a trace of discomposure was visible in her manner. She looked and spoke as quietly and unconcernedly as usual. The lowering distrust on Captain Wragge's face cleared away at the sight of her. There had been moments during the afternoon when he had seriously doubted whether the pleasure of satisfying the grudge he owed to Noel Vanstone, and the prospect of earning the sum of £200, would not be dearly purchased by running the risk of discovery to which Magdalen's uncertain temper might expose him at any hour of the day. The plain proof now before him of her powers of self-control relieved his mind of a serious anxiety. It mattered little to the captain what she suffered in the privacy of her own chamber, as long as she came out of it with a face that would bear inspection and a voice that betrayed nothing. On the way to Seaview Cottage, Captain Wragge expressed his intention of asking the housekeeper a few sympathizing questions on the subject of her invalid brother in Switzerland. He was of opinion that the critical condition of this gentleman's health might exercise an important influence on the future progress of the conspiracy. Any chance of a separation, he remarked, between the housekeeper and her master was, under existing circumstances, a chance which merited the closest investigation. "If we can only get Mrs. Lecount out of the way at the right time," whispered the captain, as he opened his host's garden gate, "our man is caught." In a minute more Magdalen was again under Noel Vanstone's roof, this time in the character of his own invited guest. The proceedings of the evening were, for the most part, a repetition of the proceedings during the morning walk. Noel Vanstone vibrated between his admiration of Magdalen's beauty and his glorification of his own possessions. Captain Wragge's inexhaustible outbursts of information, relieved by delicately indirect inquiries relating to Mrs. Lecount's brother, perpetually diverted the housekeeper's jealous vigilance from dwelling on the looks and language of her master. So the evening passed until 10 o'clock. By that time the captain's ready-made science was exhausted, and the housekeeper's temper was forcing its way to the surface. Once more Captain Wragge warned Magdalen by a look, and, in spite of Noel Vanstone's hospitable protest, wisely rose to say good night. "I have got my information," remarked the captain on the way back. "Mrs. Lecount's brother lives at Zurich. He is a bachelor. He possesses a little money, and his sister is his nearest relation. If he will only be so obliging as to break up altogether, he will save us a world of trouble with Mrs. Lecount." It was a fine moonlit night. He looked round at Magdalen as he said those words, to see if her intractable depression of spirits had seized on her again. No, her variable humour had changed once more. She looked about her with a flaunting, feverish gaiety. She scoffed at the bare idea of any serious difficulty with Mrs. Lecount. She mimicked Noel Vanstone's high-pitched voice, and repeated Noel Vanstone's high-flown compliments with a bitter enjoyment of turning him into ridicule. Instead of running into the house as before, she sauntered carelessly by her companion's side, humming little snatches of song, and kicking the loose pebbles right and left on the garden walk. Captain Wragge hailed the change in her as the best of good omens. He thought he saw plain signs that the family spirit was at last coming back again. "Well," he said, as he lit her bedroom candle for her, "when we all meet on the parade tomorrow, we shall see, as our nautical friends say, how the land lies. One thing I can tell you, my dear girl, I have used my eyes to very little purpose if there is not a storm brewing tonight in Mr. Noel Vanstone's domestic atmosphere." The captain's habitual penetration had not misled him. As soon as the door of Sea View Cottage was closed on the parting guests, Mrs. Lecount made an effort to assert the authority which Magdalen's influence was threatening already. She employed every artifice of which she was mistress to ascertain Magdalen's true position in Noel Vanstone's estimation. She tried again and again to lure him into an unconscious confession of the pleasure which he felt already in the society of the beautiful Miss Bygrave. She twined herself in and out of every weakness in his character, as the frogs and efts twined themselves in and out of the rockwork of her aquarium. But she made one serious mistake which very clever people, in their intercourse with their intellectual inferiors, are almost universally apt to commit. She trusted implicitly to the folly of a fool. She forgot that one of the lowest of human qualities, cunning, is exactly the capacity which is often most largely developed in the lowest of intellectual natures. If she had been honestly angry with her master, she would probably have frightened him. If she had opened her mind plainly to his view, she would have astonished him by presenting a chain of ideas to his limited perceptions which they were not strong enough to grasp. His curiosity would have led him to ask for an explanation, and by practicing on that curiosity she might have had him at her mercy. As it was, she set her cunning against his, and the fool proved a match for her. Noel Vanstone, to whom all large-minded motives under heaven were inscrutable mysteries, saw the small-minded motive at the bottom of his housekeeper's conduct with as instantaneous a penetration as if he had been a man of the highest ability. Mrs. Lecount left him for the night, foiled, and knowing she was foiled, left him with the tigerish side of her uppermost, and a low-lived longing in her elegant finger-nails to set them in her master's face. She was not a woman to be beaten by one defeat or by 100. She was positively determined to think, and think again, until she had found a means of checking the growing intimacy with the Bygraves at once and for ever. In the solitude of her own room she recovered her composure, and set herself, for the first time, to review the conclusions which she had gathered from the events of the day. There was something vaguely familiar to her in the voice of this Miss Bygrave, and, at the same time, in unaccountable contradiction, something strange to her as well. The face and figure of the young lady were entirely new to her. It was a striking face and a striking figure, and if she had seen either at any former period, she would certainly have remembered it. Miss Bygrave was unquestionably a stranger, and yet— She had got no further than this during the day. She could get no further now. The chain of thought broke. Her mind took up the fragments and formed another chain, which attached itself to the lady who was kept in seclusion, to the aunt, who looked well and yet was nervous, who was nervous and yet able to ply her needle and thread, an incomprehensible resemblance to some unremembered voice in the niece, an unintelligible malady which kept the aunt secluded from public view, an extraordinary range of scientific cultivation in the uncle, associated with a coarseness and audacity of manner which by no means suggested the idea of a man engaged in studious pursuits. Were the members of this small family of three what they seemed on the surface of them? With that question on her mind, she went to bed. As soon as the candle was out, the darkness seemed to communicate some inexplicable perversity to her thoughts. They wandered back from present things to past. In spite of her, they brought her old master back to life again. They revived forgotten sayings and doings in the English circle at Zurich. They veered away to the old man's death-bed at Brighton. They moved from Brighton to London. They entered the bare, comfortless room at Vauxhall Walk. They set the aquarium back in its place on the kitchen table, and put the false Miss Garth in the chair by the side of it, shading her inflamed eyes from the light. They placed the anonymous letter, the letter which glanced darkly at a conspiracy, in her hand again, and brought her with it into her master's presence. They recalled the discussion about filling in the blank space in the advertisement, and the quarrel that followed when she told Noel Vanstone that the sum he had offered was preposterously small. They revived an old doubt which had not troubled her for weeks past, a doubt whether the threatened conspiracy had evaporated in mere words, or whether she and her master were likely to hear of it again. At this point her thoughts broke off once more, and there was a momentary blank. The next instant she started up in bed, her heart beating violently, her head whirling as if she had lost her senses. With electric suddenness her mind pieced together its scattered multitude of thoughts, and put them before her plainly under one intelligible form. In the all-mastering agitation of the moment she clapped her hands together and cried out suddenly in the darkness, "Miss Vanstone again!" She got out of bed and kindled the light once more. Steady as her nerves were, the shock of her own suspicion had shaken them. Her firm hand trembled as she opened her dressing-case and took from it a little bottle of sal volatile. In spite of her smooth cheeks and her well-preserved hair, she looked every year of her age as she mixed the spirit with water, greedily drank it, and, wrapping her dressing-gown around her, sat down on the bedside to get possession again of her calmer self. She was quite incapable of tracing the mental process which had led her to discovery. She could not get sufficiently far from herself to see that her half-formed conclusions on the subject of the Bygraves had ended in making that family objects of suspicion to her, that the association of ideas had thereupon carried her mind back to that other object of suspicion which was represented by the conspiracy against her master, and that the two ideas of those two separate subjects of distrust, coming suddenly in contact, had struck the light. She was not able to reason back in this way from the effects of the cause. She could only feel that the suspicion had become more than a suspicion already. Conviction itself could not have been more firmly rooted in her mind. Looking back at Magdalen by the new light now thrown on her, Mrs. Lecount would fain have persuaded herself that she recognized some traces left of the false Miss Garth's face and figure in the graceful and beautiful girl who had sat at her master's table hardly an hour since; that she found resemblances now which she had never thought of before, between the angry voice she had heard in Vauxhall Walk and the smooth, well-bred tones which still hung on her ears after the evening's experience downstairs. She would fain have persuaded herself that she had reached these results with no undue straining of the truth as she really knew it, but the effort was in vain. Mrs. Lecount was not a woman to waste time and thought in trying to impose on herself. She accepted the inevitable conclusion that the guesswork of a moment had led her to discovery. And, more than that, she recognized the plain truth, unwelcome as it was, that the conviction now fixed in her own mind was thus far unsupported by a single fragment of producible evidence to justify it to the minds of others. Under these circumstances, what was the safe course to take with her master? If she candidly told him, when they met the next morning, what had passed through her mind that night, her knowledge of Noel Vanstone warned her that one of two results would certainly happen. Either he would be angry and disputatious, would ask for proofs, and, finding none forthcoming, would accuse her of alarming him without a cause to serve her own jealous end of keeping Magdalen out of the house; or he would be seriously startled, would clamor for the protection of the law, and would warn the Bygraves to stand on their defense at the outset. If Magdalen only had been concerned in the plot, this latter consequence would have assumed no great importance in the housekeeper's mind; but seeing the deception as she now saw it, she was far too clever a woman to fail in estimating the captain's inexhaustible fertility of resource at its true value. "If I can't meet this impudent villain with plain proofs to help me," thought Mrs. Lecount, "I may open my master's eyes to-morrow morning, and Mr. Bygrave will shut them up again before night. The rascal is playing with all his own cards under the table, and he will win the game to a certainty if he sees my hand at starting." This policy of waiting was so manifestly the wise policy, the wily Mr. Bygrave was so sure to have provided himself, in case of emergency, with evidence to prove the identity which he and his niece had assumed for their purpose, that Mrs. Lecount at once decided to keep her own counsel the next morning, and to pause before attacking the conspiracy until she could produce unanswerable facts to help her. Her master's acquaintance with the Bygraves was only an acquaintance of one day's standing. There was no fear of its developing into a dangerous intimacy if she merely allowed it to continue for a few days more, and if she permanently checked it, at the latest, in a week's time. In that period, what measures could she take to remove the obstacles which now stood in her way, and to provide herself with the weapons which she now wanted? Reflection showed her three different chances in her favor, three different ways of arriving at the necessary discovery. The first chance was to cultivate friendly terms with Magdalen, and then, taking her unawares, to entrap her into betraying herself in Noel Vanstone's presence. The second chance was to write to the elder Miss Vanstone, and to ask, with some alarming reason for putting the question, for information on the subject of her younger sister's whereabouts, and of any peculiarities in her personal appearance which might enable a stranger to identify her. The third chance was to penetrate the mystery of Mrs. Bygrave's seclusion, and to ascertain at a personal interview whether the invalid lady's real complaint might not possibly be a defective capacity for keeping her husband's secrets. Resolving to try all three chances in the order in which they are here enumerated, and to set her snares for Magdalen on the day that was now already at hand, Mrs. Lecount at last took off her dressing-gown, and allowed her weaker nature to plead with her for a little sleep. The dawn was breaking over the cold grey sea as she lay down in her bed again. The last idea in her mind before she fell asleep was characteristic of the woman. It was an idea that threatened the captain. "He has trifled with the sacred memory of my husband," thought the Professor's widow. "On my life and honor I will make him pay for it." Early the next morning Magdalen began the day, according to her agreement with the captain, by taking Mrs. Wragge out for a little exercise at an hour when there was no fear of her attracting the public attention. She pleaded hard to be left at home, having the Oriental Cashmere robe still on her mind, and feeling it necessary to read her directions for dressmaking, for the 100th time at least, before, to use her own expression, she could screw up her courage to put the scissors into the stuff. But her companion would take no denial, and she was forced to go out. The one guileless purpose of the life which Magdalen now led was the resolution that poor Mrs. Wragge should not be made a prisoner on her account; and to that resolution she mechanically clung, as the last token left her by which she knew her better self. They returned later than usual to breakfast, while Mrs. Wragge was upstairs, straightening herself from head to foot to meet the morning inspection of her husband's orderly eye, and while Magdalen and the captain were waiting for her in the parlor, the servant came in with a note from Sea View Cottage. The messenger was waiting for an answer, and the note was addressed to Captain Wragge. The captain opened the note and read these lines: "Dear Sir, Mr. Noel Vanstone desires me to write and tell you that he proposes enjoying this fine day by taking a long drive to a place on the coast here called Dunwich. He is anxious to know if you will share the expense of a carriage, and give him the pleasure of your company and Miss Bygrave's company on this excursion. I am kindly permitted to be one of the party, and if I may say so without impropriety, I would venture to add that I shall feel as much pleasure as my master if you and your young lady will consent to join us. We propose leaving Aldborough punctually at 11 o'clock. Believe me, dear sir, your humble servant, Virginie Lecount. "Who is the letter from?" asked Magdalen, noticing a change in Captain Wragge's face as he read it. "What do they want with us at Sea View Cottage?" "Pardon me," said the captain, gravely. "This requires consideration. Let me have a minute or two to think." He took a few turns up and down the room, then suddenly stepped aside to a table in a corner, on which his writing materials were placed. "I was not born yesterday, ma'am," said the captain, speaking jocosely to himself. He winked his brown eye, took up his pen, and wrote the answer. "Can you speak now?" inquired Magdalen, when the servant had left the room. "What does the letter say, and how have you answered it?" The captain placed the letter in her hand. "I have accepted the invitation," he replied, quietly. Magdalen read the letter. "Hidden enmity yesterday," she said. "An open friendship today. What does it mean?" "It means," said Captain Wragge, "that Mrs. Lecount is even sharper than I thought her. She has found you out." "Impossible!" cried Magdalen. "Quite impossible, in the time." "I can't say how she has found you out," proceeded the captain, with perfect composure. "She may know more of your voice than we supposed she knew; or she may have thought us, on reflection, rather a suspicious family; and anything suspicious in which a woman was concerned may have taken her mind back to that morning call of yours in Vauxhall Walk. Whichever way it may be, the meaning of this sudden change is clear enough. She has found you out, and she wants to put her discovery to the proof by slipping in an awkward question or two, under cover of a little friendly talk. My experience of humanity has been a varied one, and Mrs. Lecount is not the first sharp practitioner in petticoats whom I have had to deal with. All the world's a stage, my dear girl, and one of the scenes on our little stage is shut in from this moment." With those words he took his copy of Joyce's Scientific Dialogues out of his pocket. "You're done with already, my friend," said the captain, giving his useful information a farewell smack with his hand, and locking it up in the cupboard. "Such is human popularity," continued the indomitable vagabond, putting the key cheerfully in his pocket. "Yesterday Joyce was my all in all. Today I don't care that for him." He snapped his fingers and sat down to breakfast. "I don't understand you," said Magdalen, looking at him angrily. "Are you leaving me to my own resources for the future?" "My dear girl," cried Captain Wragge, "can't you accustom yourself to my dash of humor yet? I have done with my ready-made science, simply because I am quite sure that Mrs. Lecount has done believing in me. Haven't I accepted the invitation to Dunwich? Make your mind easy. The help I have given you already counts for nothing compared with the help I am going to give you now. My honor is concerned in bowling out Mrs. Lecount. This last move of hers has made it a personal matter between us." "The woman actually thinks she can take me in!" cried the captain, striking his knife handle on the table in a transport of virtuous indignation. "By heavens, I never was so insulted before in my life! Draw your chair into the table, my dear, and give me half a minute's attention to what I have to say next." Magdalen obeyed him. Captain Wragge cautiously lowered his voice before he went on. "I have told you all along," he said. "The one thing needful is never to let Mrs. Lecount catch you with your wits wool-gathering. I say the same after what has happened this morning. Let her suspect you. I defy her to find a fragment of foundation for her suspicions, unless we help her. We shall see to-day if she has been foolish enough to betray herself to her master before she has any facts to support her. I doubt it. If she has told him, We will rain down proofs of our identity with the Bygraves on his feeble little head till it absolutely aches with conviction. You have two things to do on this excursion. First, to distrust every word Mrs. Lecount says to you. Secondly, to exert all your fascinations, and make sure of Mr. Noel Vanstone, dating from today. I will give you the opportunity when we leave the carriage and take our walk at Dunwich. Wear your hat, wear your smile, do your figure justice, lace tight, put on your neatest boots and brightest gloves, tie the miserable little wretch to your apron string, tie him fast, and leave the whole management of the matter after that to me. Steady, here's Mrs. Wragge. We must be doubly careful in looking after her now. Show me your cap, Mrs. Wragge. Show me your shoes. What do I see on your apron? A spot? I won't have spots. Take it off after breakfast and put on another. Pull your chair to the middle of the table. More to the left. More still. Make the breakfast. At 11:15, Mrs. Wragge, with her own entire concurrence, was dismissed to the back room, to bewilder herself over the science of dressmaking for the rest of the day. Punctually as the clock struck the hour, Mrs. Lecount and her master drove up to the gate of North Shingles, and found Magdalen and Captain Wragge waiting for them in the garden. On the way to Dunwich nothing occurred to disturb the enjoyment of the drive. Noel Vanstone was in excellent health and high good humour. Lecount had apologized for the little misunderstanding of the previous night. Lecount had petitioned for the excursion as a treat to herself. He thought of these concessions, and looked at Magdalen, and smirked and simpered without intermission. Mrs. Lecount acted her part to perfection. She was motherly with Magdalen, and tenderly attentive to Noel Vanstone. She was deeply interested in Captain Wragge's conversation, and meekly disappointed to find it turn on general subjects, to the exclusion of science. Not a word or look escaped her which hinted in the remotest degree at her real purpose. She was dressed with her customary elegance and propriety, and she was the only one of the party on that sultry summer's day who was perfectly cool in the hottest part of the journey. As they left the carriage on their arrival at Dunwich, the captain seized a moment when Mrs. Lecount's eye was off him, and fortified Magdalen by a last warning word. "Ware the cat," he whispered. "She will show her claws on the way back." They left the village and walked to the ruins of a convent near at hand, the last relic of the once populous city of Dunwich, which has survived the destruction of the place, centuries since, by the all-devouring sea. After looking at the ruins, they sought the shade of a little wood between the village and the low sand-hills which overlook the German Ocean. Here Captain Wragge manoeuvred so as to let Magdalen and Noel Vanstone advance some distance in front of Mrs. Lecount and himself, took the wrong path, and immediately lost his way with the most consummate dexterity. After a few minutes' wandering in the wrong direction, he reached an open space near the sea, and, politely opening his camp-stool for the housekeeper's accommodation, proposed waiting where they were until the missing members of the party came that way and discovered them. Mrs. Lecount accepted the proposal. She was perfectly well aware that her escort had lost himself on purpose, but that discovery exercised no disturbing influence on the smooth amiability of her manner. Her day of reckoning with the captain had not come yet. She merely added the new item to her list, and availed herself of the camp-stool. Captain Wragge stretched himself in a romantic attitude at her feet, and the two determined enemies, grouped like two lovers in a picture, fell into as easy and pleasant a conversation as if they had been friends of 20 years' standing. "I know you, ma'am," thought the captain, while Mrs. Lecount was talking to him. "You would like to catch me tripping in my ready-made science, and you wouldn't object to drown me in the Professor's tank." "You villain with the brown eye and the green," thought Mrs. Lecount, as the captain caught the ball of conversation in his turn. "Thick as your skin is, I'll sting you through it yet." In this frame of mind toward each other they talked fluently on general subjects, on public affairs, on local scenery, on society in England and society in Switzerland, on health, climate, books, marriage, and money, talked without a moment's pause, without a single misunderstanding, on either side for nearly an hour, before Magdalen and Noel Vanstone strayed that way and made the party of four complete again. When they reached the inn at which the carriage was waiting for them, Captain Wragge left Mrs. Lecount in undisturbed possession of her master, and signed to Magdalen to drop back for a moment and speak to him. "Well," asked the captain, in a whisper, "is he fast to your apron string?" She shuddered from head to foot as she answered. "He has kissed my hand," she said. "Does that tell you enough? Don't let him sit next to me on the way home. I have borne all I can bear. Spare me for the rest of the day." "I'll put you on the front seat of the carriage," replied the captain, "side by side with me." On the journey back Mrs. Lecount verified Captain Wragge's prediction. She showed her claws. The time could not have been better chosen. The circumstances could hardly have favored her more. Magdalen's spirits were depressed, she was weary in body and mind, and she sat exactly opposite the housekeeper, who had been compelled, by the new arrangement, to occupy the seat of honor next to her master. With every facility for observing the slightest changes that passed over Magdalen's face, Mrs. Lecount tried her first experiment by leading the conversation to the subject of London, and to the relative advantages offered to residents by the various quarters of the metropolis on both sides of the river. The ever-ready Wragge penetrated her intention sooner than she had anticipated, and interposed immediately. "You're coming to Vauxhall Walk, ma'am," thought the captain. "I'll get there before you." He entered at once into a purely fictitious description of the various quarters of London in which he had himself resided, and, adroitly mentioning Vauxhall Walk as one of them, saved Magdalen from the sudden question relating to that very locality with which Mrs. Lecount had proposed startling her to begin with. From his residences he passed smoothly to himself, and poured his whole family history, in the character of Mr. Bygrave, into the housekeeper's ears, not forgetting his brother's grave in Honduras, with the monument by the self-taught negro artist, and his brother's hugely corpulent widow, on the ground floor of the boarding-house at Cheltenham. As a means of giving Magdalen time to compose herself, this outburst of autobiographical information attained its object, but it answered no other purpose. Mrs. Lecount listened without being imposed on by a single word the captain said to her. He merely confirmed her conviction of the hopelessness of taking Noel Vanstone into her confidence before she had facts to help her against Captain Wragge's otherwise unassailable position in the identity which he had assumed. She quietly waited until he had done, and then returned to the charge. "It is a coincidence that your uncle should have once resided in Vauxhall Walk," she said, addressing herself to Magdalen. "Mr. Noel has a house in the same place, and we lived there before we came to Aldborough. May I inquire, Miss Bygrave, whether you know anything of a lady named Miss Garth?" This time she put the question before the captain could interfere. Magdalen ought to have been prepared for it by what had already passed in her presence, but her nerves had been shaken by the earlier events of the day, and she could only answer the question in the negative, after an instant's preliminary pause to control herself. Her hesitation was of too momentary a nature to attract the attention of any unsuspicious person, but it lasted long enough to confirm Mrs. Lecount's private convictions, and to encourage her to advance a little further. "I only asked," she continued, steadily fixing her eyes on Magdalen, steadily disregarding the efforts which Captain Wragge made to join in the conversation, "because Miss Garth is a stranger to me, and I am curious to find out what I can about her. The day before we left town, Miss Bygrave, a person who presented herself under the name I have mentioned paid us a visit under very extraordinary circumstances." with a smooth, ingratiating manner, with a refinement of contempt which was little less than devilish in its ingenious assumption of the language of pity, she now boldly described Magdalen's appearance in disguise in Magdalen's own presence. She slightingly referred to the master and mistress of Combe Raven as persons who had always annoyed the elder and more respectable branch of the family. She mourned over the children as following their parents' example, and attempting to take a mercenary advantage of Mr. Noel Vanstone, under the protection of a respectable person's character and a respectable person's name. Cleverly including her master in the conversation, so as to prevent the captain from effecting a diversion in that quarter, sparing no petty aggravation, striking at every tender place which the tongue of a spiteful woman can wound, she would, beyond all doubt, have carried her point, and tortured Magdalen into openly betraying herself, if Captain Wragge had not checked her in full career by a loud exclamation of alarm and a sudden clutch at Magdalen's wrist. "10,000 pardons, my dear madam!" cried the captain. "I see in my niece's face, I feel in my niece's pulse, that one of her violent neuralgic attacks has come on again. My dear girl, why hesitate among friends to confess that you are in pain? What mistimed politeness! Her face shows she is suffering, doesn't it, Mrs. Lecount? Darting pains, Mr. Vanstone, darting pains on the left side of the head. Pull down your veil, my dear, and lean on me. Our friends will excuse you. Our excellent friends will excuse you for the rest of the day." Before Mrs. Lecount could throw an instant's doubt on the genuineness of the neuralgic attack, her master's fidgety sympathy declared itself exactly as the captain had anticipated, in the most active manifestations. He stopped the carriage and insisted on an immediate change in the arrangement of the places. The comfortable back seat for Miss Bygrave and her uncle, the front seat for Lecount and himself. Had Lecount got her smelling bottle? Excellent creature! Let her give it directly to Miss Bygrave, and let the coachman drive carefully. If the coachman shook Miss Bygrave, he should not have a halfpenny for himself. Mesmerism was frequently useful in these cases. Mr. Noel Vanstone's father had been the most powerful mesmerist in Europe, and Mr. Noel Vanstone was his father's son. Might he mesmerize? Might he order that infernal coachman to draw up in a shady place adapted for the purpose? Would medical help be preferred? Could medical help be found any nearer than Aldborough? That ass of a coachman didn't know. Stop every respectable man who passed in a gig, and ask him if he was a doctor. So Mr. Noel Vanstone ran on, with brief intervals for breathing time, in a continually ascending scale of sympathy and self-importance throughout the drive home. Mrs. Lecount accepted her defeat without uttering a word. From the moment when Captain Wragge interrupted her, her thin lips closed and opened no more for the remainder of the journey. The warmest expressions of her master's anxiety for the suffering young lady provoked from her no outward manifestations of anger. She took as little notice of him as possible. She paid no attention whatever to the captain, whose exasperating consideration for his vanquished enemy made him more polite to her than ever. The nearer and the nearer they got to Aldborough, the more and more fixedly Mrs. Lecount's hard black eyes looked at Magdalen, reclining on the opposite seat, with her eyes closed and her veil down. It was only when the carriage stopped at North Shingles, and when Captain Wragge was handing Magdalen out, that the housekeeper at last condescended to notice him. As he smiled and took off his hat at the carriage door, the strong restraint she had laid on herself suddenly gave way, and she flashed one look at him which scorched up the captain's politeness on the spot. He turned at once, with a hasty acknowledgment of Noel Vanstone's last sympathetic inquiries, and took Magdalen into the house. "I told you she would show her claws," he said. "It is not my fault that she scratched you before I could stop her. She hasn't hurt you, has she?" "She has hurt me to some purpose," said Magdalen. She has given me the courage to go on. Say what must be done tomorrow, and trust me to do it." She sighed heavily as she said these words and went up to her room. Captain Wragge walked meditatively into the parlor, and sat down to consider. He felt by no means so certain as he could have wished of the next proceeding on the part of the enemy after the defeat of that day. The housekeeper's farewell look had plainly informed him that she was not at the end of her resources yet, and the old militiaman felt the full importance of preparing himself in good time to meet the next step which she took in advance. He lit a cigar and bent his wary mind on the dangers of the future. While Captain Wragge was considering in the parlor at North Shingles, Mrs. Lecount was meditating in her bedroom at Sea View. Her exasperation at the failure of her first attempt to expose the conspiracy had not blinded her to the instant necessity of making a second effort before Noel Vanstone's growing infatuation got beyond her control. The snare set for Magdalen having failed, the chance of entrapping Magdalen's sister was the next chance to try. Mrs. Lecount ordered a cup of tea, opened her writing-case, and began the rough draft of a letter, to be sent to Miss Vanstone, the elder, by the morrow's post. So the day's skirmish ended. The heat of the battle was yet to come. End of Chapter 5. Scene 4.